welcome everyone to our panel, Contentious Elections. We have 5 great papers today, really packed panel. So we'll go in order of the program. And so first we have Predicting Civilian Electoral Contention by Maya Dalton.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Maya Dalton. I am a PhD candidate at Penn State in political science and social data analytics. I am presenting the first chapter of my dissertation, which I will be defending in 2 weeks, so fingers crossed that that goes well. Basically, what this paper does is shifts from asking why electoral violence happens to whether it can be predicted from its observable institutional features. So the puzzle, the research question here asks, under what conditions do elections produce violent rather than nonviolent contention from civilians? So firstly, civilians are the most frequent instigators of election violence, as you can see from this plot here. This is from the Electoral Contention and Violence data set, which I'll explain a bit more when I get to my data section. But secondly, civilians are not necessarily uniformly peaceful. They tend to engage in a lot more instances of violence than nonviolence from this data set. So what this paper does, it asks, can we predict when civilians will turn violent and why? So, as I mentioned, this paper posits a prediction-oriented design, not necessarily a causal identification design. Traditionally, we use our causal regression testing to test our hypotheses, but this can sometimes hide interacting institutional effects and introduce multicollinearity. For this paper, I use machine learning approaches benchmarked against a logistic regression model to handle these interactions and potentially capture nonlinearities. So prediction in this context complements explanation and what we already know about election violence and civilians becoming violent, and reveals if there are patterned behaviors from these civilians. So I examined 3 theoretical dimensions of predictors that may explain civilians' behavior. So we have judicial credibility, so formal legal channels to express grievances, so corrupt or dependent or independent courts. Political contestation channels, so opposition parties that may be banned, government intimidation, election boycotts. And then finally, perceived efficacy of civilian action. So does collective action seem worth the risk? Civil society strength, freedom of assembly, those types of variables. These 3 dimensions map onto the kitchen sink mess of predictors that I will explain here in a few slides. So for the data, as I mentioned, I use the Electoral Contention and Violence, or ECAV data set. The main outcome here is civilian violence. This is a binary outcome. 1 if electoral contention includes violence, 0 if it remains peaceful. This does not capture any kind of severity or fatality threshold like other variables like the UCDP or VDEM election violence data. This data includes over 1,700 election rounds in 121 countries from 1989 to 2013. And the data is balanced with about a 50-50 violent to nonviolent split. As I mentioned, there are a lot of predictor variables, but the machine learning models thankfully can handle multicollinearity and that kind of stuff. They come from a bunch of different data sets, including NELDA, varieties of democracy, quality of governments, the Signorelli Siri data, UCDP, and ACLID. These predictors include, as I mentioned, judicial credibility, independence, corruption, opposition and contestation channels, so like banned political parties, civil society and assembly rights, physical integrity violations, and they also include lagged and contemporaneous violence variables, population, GDP, regime type. So, as I mentioned, I compare 3 models. So we have our logistic regression baseline with elastic net regularization. This is your, cream of the crop logistic regression model used for prediction. I also use a random forest. This is an ensemble of decision trees, and it captures a lot of nonlinearities, and it is robust to multicollinearity that may come from all those predictor variables that I mentioned. And then finally, I also use a neural network. So this basically learns patterns across features and picks out which ones have higher prediction capabilities. I validate these models via a five-fold nested approach, tuning the hyperparameters, just used to compare out-of-sample performance fairly across the three models. So these are the main results. It's pretty obvious that the machine learning models outperform the logit by a little bit. The random forest performs the best with a 74.1% accuracy in predicting when civilians become violent correctly. Um, the neural network is close behind with about a 72%, and then the logit 71%. Then the precision recall area under the curve, basically, is this better than random guessing? So if your AUC is close to like 0.5, that means it's basically a coin flip. So the random forest does the best in this as well with about a 0.878 AUC, so strong discriminatory power. Both machine learning models beat out the logit model. This kind of shows that electoral violence, especially in civilians, is predictable, not just random or episodic. Um, I also examined what variables are actually important to predicting civilian violent contention via permutation importance. What permutation importance shows is if you take one of the variables out of the model, will it significantly affect the accuracy score? Instead of reading out this whole plot, I put it into a nice chart to kind of show what's actually important for prediction and what's not. So here you can see that government coercion variables, so intimidation, violation of physical integrity, and right to peaceful assembly are important to prediction. Things like mobilization capacity, so civil society organization is also important, and path dependence of violence, which has kind of been known in the political violence literature that violence begets violence, are pretty consistent predictors. The judicial variables are not important. They don't add a lot to the prediction models. And then there are a couple variables that are mixed. So they're only important in the machine learning models, banned opposition, boycotts, and then GDP and population. I also did some initial analyses to kind of get at the nitty-gritty of what these results actually show. So I examined partial dependence plots, and these basically show global patterns and the marginal effect of one feature on predicted violence. So I took the, I believe, five most important variables from the results I just showed and looked at each model to show how that feature relates to predicted civilian violence. So in this plot on the right here, you can see that the random forest captures a lot of nonlinear effects. It's very sharp jumps and changes in violence risk once these variables cross a threshold, whether that's the intimidation, the civil society, physical integrity, etc. The neural network also captures more of a nonlinear effect with some curves and some, little jumps, whereas the logit model just shows a straight line. So what this means is that the machine learning models do capture more nonlinear effects that might be missed by our traditional logistic regression models. I also examine SHAP values. Basically, this shows how much an individual feature contributes to predictive performance. So here you can see the random forest lagged electoral violence contributes about 0.53% or 0.53 to that case's predicted probability. The neural network spreads things a bit more evenly across the violence variables, so civilian deaths and civilian violence, a little bit on like things like population, GDP, regime type. And then finally, the logit model really just focuses on civilian deaths. So that was a lot of results thrown at you in a short amount of time, and I know I'm coming up close to 10 minutes. But to summarize, the core finding is that past violence predicts future violence. There is a delayed repression dynamic where accumulated grievances raise the risk of future elections or future escalations of election violence. And these findings aren't necessarily new. We knew, again, that violence begets violence, but it shows that civilians becoming violent during election periods is not just random, but it is something that happens because of the institutional features. There's also the coercion and mobilization aspect, so government intimidation, civil
We're at 10
society.
minutes.
Okay, I have one more slide. Civil society participation and peaceful assembly also affect that. And I will skip over contributions, limitations. I've kind of mentioned these. In the future, I think pairing this with causal identification and subnational data would really showcase this prediction approach. So that is it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And next we have between finality and accuracy, vote recount institutions in European democracies.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak in front of Electoral Integrity Projects panel. My name is Ivan Jarabinsky, and I'm from the Institute H21. I'm the head of the election research, and together with my colleague Patrik Mikoczi, we work on this paper we call Between Finality and Accuracy, Vote Recount Institutions in European Democracies. The idea of this paper came out of my personal frustration, I would say, because I was observing for a long time, as I'm based in Czechia and as I'm Czech, I was observing that Supreme Administrative Court in Czechia is supposed to do election recounts, but I didn't see really capacities in this court to do it when extensive recount is taking place. So. And the Supreme Administrative Court, they basically admitted this in 2017 after they ran an extensive recount, and they warned that they just met their structural limits under tight deadlines they need to operate. And a year and a half ago, in Romania, there was another source of shock for me, because the Constitutional Court, they ordered a full first round recount, but they said the hearing on the very next day, leaving basically no more time to conduct the recount. And I was like, you really don't have a schedule for these kind of things. So in other words, I want to say that I feel the topic is very relevant, and the responses, institutional responses, are pretty diverse. So I just wanted to know, like, what's the situation across the Europe, and I didn't find much because electoral justice is a really understudied field, and vote recounts are even more so. And literature is really dominated, I would say, by the US single case studies. So yeah, so the comparative European practice is basically lacking, I would say. I also tried to check some available data, also Electoral Integrity Projects data, but also others. And they were not that much useful for me. The most useful was International IDEA Electoral Justice Database, but they are speaking broader, on broader level about electoral justice, not about the specific vote recounts. And I really think this topic really matters, because how recounts are handled, it can shape trust in elections, elected bodies where it's relevant, also judicial systems and the whole regime. So when I was thinking about this topic, I was like coming up with potential hypotheses or theories around it, but there was not this independent variable for me, so I would say. So I was just thinking, well, what we need to do now is just institutionally map how voter counts are conducted across Europe, and that's basically a question of this paper. But we wanted to describe this based on the background of my source of frustration, which was this finality accuracy dilemma. And what we mean by this is that there are basically two competing imperatives. Like, one, there is finality, which is like, well, elections are over, and the results are treated as authoritative and binding. And when we speak about accuracy, this is different narrative based on the idea that declares results must faithfully reflect voter preferences. And if we are suspicious about the results in some way, why not to check it or recount it? So the idea is like every recount prioritizes accuracy over finality, and every refusal to recount does the reverse, basically. And we mapped this based on 5 dimensions, based on standing, who may initiate the complaint, based on threshold conditions. This is pretty important aspect for us, on which basis a review is activated. Decision-making body, it's not just about who decides in this sense, but it's also about who counts, because this can be 2 separate bodies. And then we focused on the scope, like how much is expected to be recounted, and some procedural deadlines, filling and adjudication deadlines, and based on each of these dimensions operationalizes the accuracy finality dilemma at a different level. So we focused on 10 European countries based on their comparability, in a sense that they are members of Council of Europe under the European Court of Human Rights jurisdiction, and they operate on single instance electoral judiciaries to make the cases more comparable. And we run the structure-focused comparison, where we are focusing on the same set of, let's say, questions in every case, and we also, as a sources, we used the basic legal documents, and we also utilized one recent recount case per country, which provided us some insight into how this works, and it serves rather as institutional vignette in our research. No, we are not creating any data sets of recounts. So let's go to the results. Well, standing to initiate the recount, we see that most of the sample of our 10 countries sits on the accessibility side of the dilemma. 7 of 10 countries grant voters direct standing, which we code as broad standing, and only 3 countries limit voters like significantly in their ability to raise a complaint. Speaking about threshold conditions, this means the basis on which recount is triggered, and to make the countries comparable, we built a simple additive index of finality protection, which has 3 components: the evidentiary threshold, which says how strong evidence you need to have to initiate the recount, then the procedural posture, which is whether whether a decision-making body is only reactionary or they have some inquisitory powers, and whether there is some parallel correction mechanism during the count. And we can see, then we sorted the countries based on their results, and they can have up to 5 points. 5 points means that they are strictly finality oriented in this sense, and 0 points is like they are strictly accuracy oriented. And we can see that most of the sample sits on the finality side, while a non-country is occupying this strict accuracy pole. And for me, it's also interesting that the Nordic countries are sitting in the middle of this, which in my eyes creates this balanced approach in between these two sides of the spectrum. Decision-making bodies are important because not just because of who is deciding, but also who is recounting, and we are separating these two. But we can see that, speaking about decision-making bodies, 5 countries use courts, 3 uses parliaments or the committees and 2 countries, Norway and Sweden, they use mixed bodies, and all 5 courts are apex courts, which are strong on legitimacy but limited in their investigative capacity. And maybe this can be also part of the reason why 7 countries, which was quite shocking, honestly, to me, because in Czechia we don't have this, but 7 countries delegate the actual count to separate recounting body, and only Italy and Czechia recount in-house. So in Slovakia, we really don't know because they never did run the recount. And maybe this can be also part of the fact that they are on the strict finality side, as I was speaking about it in a minute before. The thing is that the delegation extends investigative capacity without sacrificing the timeliness that the finality requires. These 3 aspects I just spoke about will contribute to
We're at
groupings.
Ivan, we're at 10 minutes, just like
I'm in 3 minutes, I'm done. They will group together. The countries will group together based on these 3 aspects I just mentioned, and there are 2 more which don't contribute to creation of these groupings. And this is the scope where we work with the idea that larger districts raise the implicit cost of accuracy-seeking decisions. So we sorted the countries due to the proxy of district size, from Malta to Slovakia, from 27,000 voters per district to 4.5 million, and but it doesn't contribute to groupings, and the results from this are pretty weak. And I just want to mention the last aspect, which is procedural deadlines. They don't contribute to the groupings, but I will speak in a minute. But it's pretty interesting because the Venice Commission recommends 3 to 5 days for filling and adjudication deadlines, and most of the sample takes longer. So in some countries where there are no formal deadlines, speaking about adjudication, then the electoral calendar often constrain the timing. But generally, I can say the temporal design leans toward thorough investigation over rapid finality, as it is basically contradictory to Venice Commission's recommendations. So here are the 5 recurring configurations based on the three aspects. These are judicial restrictive, finality oriented, and so on. You can see it on the screen. And what we can see here is that there is sort of, I would say, correlation between decision-making body and threshold, where courts are rather finality oriented, and they call for strong evidence to initiate the recount, while the other decision-making bodies are not not having these high thresholds, I would say. And there is also an asymmetry, as I said, with respect to the threshold, and most of the countries are sitting on the finality side of it, and basically it's Nordic countries sitting outside or in soft position. So it's pretty interesting to me. But I would like to say that the fact that
Ivan, we're at 13 minutes. Can we wrap up?
Yeah, this is the last slide, so I'll just finish. I just don't want to be misinterpreted that I'm saying that parliamentary decision-making bodies are flexible. Therefore, we should call for parliamentary bodies to have, because these are basically in the conflict of interest, which is also mapped in the literature, and there are coming other questions based on this research, but I'm not going through them because of the time. So thank you very much. And
now we have media exposure in elections. Can visibility deter violence?
So thank you, everyone. This is a work in progress that we're working on this. My co-author, Lorena Torres, who is also in this call. and myself. I present myself. I am Amalia Pulido. For now, I am the head of the electoral management body in the state of Mexico. That is the largest state in the country. And Lorena, it's a PhD candidate at CIDE here in Mexico City. So we came with this idea or with this question about we know that we have a lot of withdrawal in the electoral context in Mexico. That means candidates basically left the contest because several reasons. And how this works is that they come to the electoral authority and they just resign. They don't have to mention any explanation. They just can left the race. And so we are wondering what are the conditions that make this happen? So that's basically our first question when we start looking at this. So we know that Mexico has violence in the elections, especially in 2024. We have the most violent electoral cycle in our recent history. In this election, Data Civica reported 659 candidates, officials, and also facilities attacked by criminal organizations or other groups. And also in this election cycle, there were almost 21,000 positions for local and federal elections. And in our state, in the state of Mexico, we have 1,300 positions contested in the state of Mexico alone. So we think that this context is really interesting to look for this question, and that's the reason we're looking for this. So our research question is, does media visibility modify the likelihood of formal withdrawal among candidates in municipalities where organized crime has captured local authorities? So we have like an interaction research question. In one hand, we want to look at this withdrawal effect in the electoral contest, but also we know that we have a lot of state capture especially at the local level. So we're looking at the municipalities in the state of Mexico and how the media visibility modify or increases or decreases the likelihood that actually candidates left the electoral contest. So in where this paper fits, we think that this fits in the literature about candidate withdrawal. We don't have a lot of knowledge about this effect. As I already mentioned, candidates actually don't say the reasons why they left the contest. So I think this is also interesting. But also we find a lot of interesting literature about voter turnout, electoral authorities' capacity, and of course the state capture literature that it's growing, especially in the Latin American context. So we know that state capture happens in Mexico and in other countries. Why we say that? We have the presence of criminal organizations, and what the state capture literature says is that extra-legal actors need collusion with local authorities to maintain their business and to grow their business. So basically, criminal organizations behave differently according to political, economic, and geographical opportunities. And there are like two main strategies for criminal organizations to influence politics. So one is capture. So basically they capture candidates, they capture local governments, and the other one is violence. So basically they target and they attack high-profile political actors. So these are like the two main strategies that criminal organizations have to influence politics. So also our paper fits in this or talks with this type of literature, looking at this local effect of the withdrawal. So also we know that there are some national regimes of criminal governance, and there's a lot of work that has been grading in this aspect. So what are also the effects on electoral supply? So criminal organizations identify and pressure specific candidates, is not randomly. So that's also something that we can see from the data and from past elections. And we argue that visibility alters the cost-benefit calculus of political participation. So the fact that a candidate has this visibility can affect the probability or the likelihood that actually is left in the electoral contest. And we think, and because we look at the literature, that this is a question that is underexplored, how visibility shapes this calculus. So basically, if a candidate, especially in the local context, has this visibility, it will alter the cost benefit for this political participation. So just moving to the hypothesis, we have two hypotheses. The hypothesis one is the vulnerability effect. And we say that higher media visibility increases the probability of formal withdrawal, and visible candidates become identifiable targets for coercion. But also we have the hypothesis two, the protection effect. And as I already mentioned at the beginning, this is a work in progress, and you can say, well, these two hypotheses are in contrast with each other. And that's true because we're trying to figure out the causal mechanism here. So the hypothesis two is the protection effect hypothesis, and we argue that higher media visibility decreases the probability of formal withdrawal because public exposures creates a reputational shield, but also it has a higher cost to attack or to intimidate a candidate who actually has this media visibility because he or she is already known in the community. So we create this original data set of candidates in the state of Mexico for this year, 2024. We have a sample of almost 8,000 candidates in 125 municipalities. The state of Mexico has 125 municipalities. And what we find is that our dependent variable, or the outcome, the ones, that means that the candidates who actually left the contest, we have this proportion of 4.4%. It's a random, or it's more like a rare event. So we are dealing with this, or we are trying to deal with this in our models. So we have our dependent variable, who is the withdraw. It's a dummy variable. 1 if we receive a formal withdrawal petition, and 0 if it remains in the ballot. We have our main independent variables, and we code these 3 different ways to notice if it has social visibility, or the candidate doesn't have this social visibility. So we have the news media mention. That means that the candidate actually was mentioned in one local or national newspaper. A second variable, it's if it has a social media profile, TikTok, Facebook, X, or whatever, and also if the candidate has institutional web page. So these are the 3 ways where we are measuring this social visibility. And also because one of the important part of this argument is the state capture. In the state of Mexico, but also in the country, we have different operatives that are run by the federal police or the local police. So we can identify which municipalities actually have these operatives. So for example, in the state of Mexico, we have one operative that called Enjambre. So basically, the police authorities identify that these municipalities have criminal operations, or in theoretical terms, they have this state capture. So we are also control for whether or not the municipalities has first an operative in general, and second, Enjambre operative in particular in these municipalities. And we have other control variables, as some demographics of the candidates, and some controls for the municipal effect. So the data collection, as I already mentioned, is original data set. So we look at the local and national media outlets, the social media, the official institution webpage, and we did a systematic online searches per candidate. And we have these visibility variables, I already mentioned, binary variables for the 3 ways we're measuring this visibility variable, the news, the social, and the institutional. And I will just skip this slide because I think I have little time left. So, but the key findings, we have this right skew distribution for our dependent variables. So this is important because this is the geographic distribution of the organized crime operatives. As I already mentioned, we have different types of operatives. So this is the image.
Amalia, we're at 10 minutes.
Yes, so I will close. So this is the image of the state of Mexico, and we can see the distribution of the several operatives. We have three models, the main models with the full sample, the subsample 1 and the subsample 2. Subsample 2 is the most important because we have the enjambre, just the municipalities that actually have the enjambre operative, and we can direct test our hypothesis 1 and a hypothesis 2. We run a multi-level logistic regression with random intercepts, and I will skip this. So what we find, and I will just skip to this, is that visibility is a protection and is strongest precisely where criminal capture is documented. So basically, where we have the state capture, which means, and we know we have the state capture because we have these operatives, visibility decreases the probability that a candidate is left in the race. So basically, this visibility or this social visibility is significant in our models. We, of course, we have to work more in the causal mechanism and also in the models, but we're finding that this social visibility matters and basically reduces the likelihood that a candidate is leaving the race in municipalities where we know there are state capture going on. So I think also interesting findings is that women are less likely to leave the race in general. So I think this is also really interesting. And also the least position is significant. This variable is significant. So lower ranked candidates consistently are more vulnerable. So this is our main findings, and I think the contributions is because we are talking about something that is happening in the electoral contest and also in this local level, and it's talking with the state capture literature, and but also we're like having this interaction with the social media, and we are finding that this has de facto protective mechanism in violent settings. We have some limitations that we're trying to deal. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you very much. And next we have electoral returns to vote buying evidence from Brazil.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amalia Basak. I'm a PhD candidate at Syracuse University. And today I'm going to present our paper with Jessie Trudeau, which is titled as The Electoral Returns to Vote Buying Evidence from Brazil. In this paper, we ask whether vote buying wins, and if so, by how much. Vote buying is a low-cost, high-reward electoral strategy for candidates operating in settings with high baseline levels of clientelism. There's an extensive literature on how vote buying works, yet there is only little empirical evidence about whether vote buying helps candidates win or not. At the same time, the literature is divided about the issue, as some studies show vote buying increases the chance of victory, while some studies show that it decreases the chance of victory. So we find that there is a gap in the literature about the effect of vote buying on electoral victory. And in this study, we aim to address this gap. To answer our research question, we rely on a novel data set on candidate-level malfeasance, which we call Brazilian Electoral Complaints Database. We leverage exogenous variation in voters' motives to file a complaint, and we show that vote buying increases candidates' chance of winning by 16.3 percentage points. We find that the more the vote buying, the higher the candidate's chance of victory. The original database we constructed contains more than 30,000 voter complaints about electoral misconduct in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. We obtained this data by requesting information from State Electoral Authority, and the Electoral Authority has this data because voters can submit anonymous electoral tips through an online form on the State of Rio de Janeiro Public Prosecutor's website or by using an app called Pardo. Our data contains complaints about candidates running in 2018 federal and state elections and 2020 local election. The raw data includes the date and location of the complaint, candidate's name, political party, and the complaint text. And here we share an example of a complaint where the user complains that a certain candidate is distributing food baskets with her campaign manager in exchange for votes. We clean the complaint text and use candidate names as a crosswalk to link our database to other data sources. We use both string matching protocol and hand coding to resolve the tricky errors with spelling and nicknames. We then link our data with the data on electoral returns for each candidate, candidate demographics, party level characteristics, as well as municipal level indicators. We also geocode the complaints and obtain information about their exact geographical distribution. We use algorithmic text processing to classify complaint text in 5 non-mutually exclusive categories. The first category is what we call campaign modalities, which includes complaints about campaign-related ads, materials, events, and the use of social media. And different from the rest of the categories, these modalities are not forms of malfeasance by themselves, though they can be used in illegal ways. The second category is vote buying, which is central to our study. This category includes allegations about candidates distributing gifts, using patronage, or using brokers in order to buy votes. We also classify complaints for use of public machine, prohibited campaigning, and physical coercion, but they fall outside the scope of the current study. In this study, we only focus on complaints about vote buying. And here's an example of a vote buying complaint that says that the mayor is offering jobs in exchange for his re-election. He's appointing several people every day who cannot be appointed, and he appoints a relative to receive the position. Here we show the distribution of all electoral malfeasance we coded, and we show that, among others, vote buying is the most common illegal strategy voters complain about. To investigate the relationship between vote buying complaints and winning, we estimate a series of OLAS models. In all models, our outcome variable is an indicator if the candidate wins. Our treatment is an indicator or count of being mentioned in vote buying complaints. And we also include a vector of party, candidate, and municipality level controls. We use fixed effects for territorial unit, office, and election year, and we cluster the standard errors at the territorial unit level. We argue that variation in being the subject of vote buying complaints is the result of a quasi-random combination of first, candidate level usage of vote buying, and second, voter level motivation to file a report to the electoral authorities. We contend that being named in a complaint is an as-if random function of these two factors, conditional on exposure to the reporting platform and exposure to the candidate. We condition exposure to the reporting platform on municipality and exposure to the candidate on incumbency and candidate's office level. We draw from theories of claim making to support the argument that, all else equal, individual voters have different probabilities of filing a complaint. We contrast this with party-level clientelism measures, which are endogenous to a variety of other party-level predictors of electoral performance. Here we share a placebo test that shows party-level clientelism measures are endogenous, but vote buying complaints are orthogonal to other party-level predictors of electoral performance. And considering the time, I will not be going into too much detail here, but I'm happy to talk about it later. In this table, we present our main results by showing the relationship between electoral victory and being named in a vote buying complaint. We start with the simple bivariate correlation in model 1. Then in other models, we add election year, office level, and territorial unit level fixed effects. Then we control for candidate level demographic variables and municipal level controls. Finally, we add candidate level incumbency status and party level ideology measures. And across all models, we find a positive, statistically significant relationship between being mentioned in a vote buying complaint and winning the election. We show in the model 8 that buying votes leads to 16.3 percentage points increase in the probability of victory. And in later models in this table, we show positive and statistically significant relationship between winning and all subcomponents of the vote buying measure, which are complaints about providing gifts to voters, using brokers, or using patronage. In this table, we show the relationship between winning and vote buying operationalized as a continuous count variable instead of a dummy. Model 1 to Model 4 show that the results are highly significant and positive, controlling for incumbency status, ideology, municipality characteristics, and candidate demographics. In Model 5 to Model 8, we run the same regressions for the sample that only includes candidate with one or more complaints. And we find that even compared to other candidates mentioned in the complaint database, vote buying is positively associated with a greater chance of victory. We also interact vote buying complaints with other predictors of victory and with other types of malfeasance. We find that incumbents and candidates with more campaign resources experience higher returns to vote buying. We also find no evidence of higher returns to vote buying when it is combined with other types of malfeasance. We run further robustness and validity checks, and I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Overall, in this paper, we make a theoretical contribution by focusing on the candidates' incentives and counterfactual outcome if they did not engage in vote buying. We also make a significant methodological and empirical contribution, as we demonstrate that vote buying do increase a candidate's probability of victory in elections by using a novel candidate-level database from citizen complaints about electoral malfeasance. Thank you for listening. We are so eager to hear your comments and questions.
Great, thank you very much. And then finally, we have between breakdown and the ballot, how interim governments can foster legitimacy and pave the way for credible elections.
All right, so I am Fernanda Barreau. I'm the Deputy Director of IFS Center for Applied Research and Learning. This is a report we published a couple of months ago, and the context for it was that, by the end of 2025, we saw that at least a dozen countries were led by transitional authorities. Of course, they changed, they varied a lot in terms of structure and the composition of those governments. So we had civilians, we had military governments, we had centralized versus shared power. And we had some governments that had very short horizons, right? Like an 18 months period for credible, to deliver credible elections, and some that had very long horizons and were going through like one postponement after another. Regardless, what we see is that those countries have common challenges, right? One is to build legitimacy for that government in the absence of the ballot box, and steer the country to stability and hopefully credible elections. So this is not a quantitative research. We are not trying to make any causal claims here either. This is mostly about understanding like the lessons learned from our practitioner experience, from people who were supporting those election commissions and interim governments during those transitions. We also leveraged some academic literature, especially some case studies on those transitions. But the idea here was really to understand like the smaller scale, the discrete decisions that were taken, and we think, at least like from our firsthand experience, to have helped build this legitimacy and lead to credible elections. So one of the main definitions used for interim governments is that of Shane, Liz, and Barrett. So those are institutions tasked with facilitating a country's transition to democratic political order in free and contested elections. But of course, there are plenty of interim governments, like caretaker governments. They're already, prescribing constitutions, and they already have a clear mandate. So we kind of excluded those from this analysis because we really wanted to see the countries that had a more chaotic context in which everything was very fragile. So the struggle for legitimacy comes from a series of factors. One is that those governments are unelected, as I mentioned, so they were not chosen by the people. They don't have that card in their hands to say, like, we have the public legitimacy to do our jobs. They usually have undefined mandates, as long as they're not constitutionally prescribed caretaker governments. Sometimes it's hard to identify like what powers they have, what timelines they have to deliver on their tasks. They're fragile by design, right? Without this legitimacy, any kind of decisions or contested decisions can lead to failure. But it's also a very high stakes environment in which, if they do a good job, it can really change the democratic path of that country, or bring it back to turmoil and instability. So on fostering legitimacy without elections, we saw a number of different good examples of how to do that, and also some bad examples, right? So,
Una puerta sufriendo.
sorry, Sophia. Okay, I just muted. So one of them is the motivation and capacity, right? Showing the motivation to actually represent a different number of people. We have the example here of Tunisia, where powerful CSOs stepped in amid a gridlock to develop a roadmap for a political renewal, and they were really showing that those different organizations were backing up that interim government. The case of Bangladesh, and I'm going to be bringing that up many times here because it's a recent one, and we were very much involved. We saw, the selection of a leader very quick happened very quickly. and with the buy-in of the main political parties and civil society organizations. And then we have different bad examples like Syria, right? And recently there was the People's Assembly indirect elections where members were elected in very opaque ways. So it doesn't show that willingness to really include people in decisions. Legal backing is also one of the big factors that we saw across our examples. Again, with Bangladesh, even if the government was what they called a revolutionary government that came out of necessity, they still tried and they went to the Supreme Court and asked for a formal opinion on the interim government's legitimacy and whether they could keep doing what they were doing. Security backing is one of the biggest issues, especially in the coup belt of Africa, right? We see that the military can be a big asset or a big liability in transitions. In Mali, we saw a coup within a coup, right? Bangladesh also had a history of military coups, but in this last transition, the interim government made sure to secure the support of the military. They went to the media and they said very explicitly that they would support the interim government for a period of 18 months. And it also kind of helped the government keep the timeline, right? Knowing that at the end of that 18-month period, they might be overthrown by the military. Another lesson was to have a delimited mandate and to deliver on milestones, very clear milestones. People get very impatient, right, during transitions if they take too long and you don't see any progress. So some of the countries that started already doing the release of political prisoners, especially during after post-conflict or post-repressive environments, to repeal repressive laws, to really reform the playing field for elections. Transitional justice systems, an electoral roadmap to make sure that people are seeing some progress towards change. But also we do need to make sure that those timelines are realistic, right? As I said, Mali, the coup within the coup, and now Goita got the backup of his military allies to say that he can stay there. His mandate can be renewed as many times as necessary until the country is pacified, but with no clear milestones. Their thing is, of course, checks and balances, which is much harder to establish and follow in a fragile context like this. But we also do have good examples of countries that establish those, even if interim institutions, like the higher authority for the achievement of the objectives of the revolution, political reform, and democratic transition in Tunisia, that functioned as a transitional legislature and could, hold the interim executive accountable. In Sudan, that was also planned, but it could not be established due to some disagreements over the composition of those institutions. And then this is where we work on more explicitly, more directly, delivering credible elections. One of the main issues, of course, during the transitions is to ensure that referee, right, of the elections are trustworthy. We have some examples of countries that managed to do that by bringing non-partisan leaders of known integrity, but mainly, that people would trust them. In Bangladesh, because it was very well known that the election administration was politically compromised by the Sheikh Hasina government, they investigated and removed some of those individuals who were involved in the elections. Which was seen, with positive eyes by most observers. But also we have to avoid going too far, as in the case of Iraq, where the de-Baathification process led really to the purge of civil servants and left the election administration without the capacity to organize elections. Essential reforms, as I was saying before too, having this clear timeline for essential reforms to level the playing field, especially after authoritarian governments. In Bangladesh, they did that with basic reforms for the transitional elections, and then deeper reforms that they put in a referendum. Syria had he's been having a very complicated path, right, with very inconsistent reforms and enforcement of them. But also we have to make sure that the election administration has the capacity to enforce those. So in Afghanistan is also a very interesting case in which they tried to implement some reforms. They tried to make it illegal for individuals who were involved with armed groups to run for elections, but they really had no capacity to investigate those candidates.
Fernanda, we're at 10 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I'll finish this. So transparent communication is also a very important point in Bangladesh recently, as the European Union complimented the election administration for that kind of transparency. Abstaining from running is also a big one. So in Bangladesh, again, the interim leader decided not to run, but Bolivia and Chad and many other countries, they did. And it kind of ruined the whole perception of neutrality of the process. Timely delivery, the impatience of not being able to deliver in Haiti, it's still no election in sight. And just to finalize this, like what implementers of assistance can do, like us, we can work as, anticipate those windows of opportunity to engage democratically, provide continuity, especially in those contexts of coups within coups. In some contexts, the election technical assistant is the only organization capable of maintaining some kind of continuity in processes, and bringing the neutrality and legitimacy that sometimes political actors in the country will not have to get people to participate. But yeah, I'll finish here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And now we have discussant comments from Lorraine Minnite, maybe 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Minnite is the name. But I want to start by saying that this is really a fascinating set of papers on different forms of electoral contention and a variety of context, institutional, behavioral, historical, for investigating explanatory, predictive, classificatory questions on topics that are central concern to the study of electoral integrity. Several of the papers bring an explicitly institutional orientation to their investigations and analytical expectations, although there's also an emphasis on motivated agency and strategic decision-making as motor forces in the phenomena that's being investigated. So just to, this is impossible. 10 minutes is impossible because these papers are just great. They're really, really excellent. And there's so many findings across all of the papers. So I had a very difficult time trying to condense everything into something I hope would be useful. But first, divide the papers into two groups for just some general comments, and then proceed from there with a few questions for each author. So the two groups are, one set of papers sort of addresses forms of electoral malfeasance, like election violence and vote buying, and others are looking more, I think, a little bit at remedies for improving electoral credibility. The two papers on electoral violence and vote buying are all grappling with, in one way or another, with the familiar but always confounding difficulties for empirical research and statistical modeling that we all face in studying hidden phenomena, sensitive topics, the lag of the past on the present, and other forms of social complexity. So, while electoral violence obviously is not hidden, the complex institutional conditions under which it can be predicted are obscured. How can we observe how the likely threat of violence may operate to potentially distort elections and their outcomes by constraining voter choice and the decision-making process of candidates who choose to withdraw from the ballot before the election? Why do political candidates engage in vote buying under conditions of the modern secret ballot? And how does this illicit activity nevertheless produce benefits to candidates that outweigh the costs? So among the many contributions to knowledge of these three papers, I would emphasize, obviously, the methodological innovations. They all use creative statistical and analytical strategies combined with unique and original data sets to investigate these different forms of electoral malfeasance. I just can't say enough about how impressed I am with that work, because I know how difficult and time-consuming it is. With respect to the other two papers, the paper on recounts and the recommendations for transitional governments on how to produce credible elections, their contributions, I think, speak a little more to theoretical development in the study of electoral integrity. It's interesting to try to probe for connections between these two sets of papers. For example, although the paper on recounts focuses on European cases and the paper on civilian electoral violence is based on a record of incidents that are mostly outside of Europe, I wonder about whether recount regimes within a non-European institutional context could be designed or are designed to reduce the likelihood of violence, although the record of violence in European elections is different than it is in other parts of the world. And so I'm interested to hear from any of the panelists or the audience if they have thoughts about whether there are insights to be gained from triangulating the analyses of problems and solutions that we have in this not so random collection of papers, but panels are always a little bit random. But before we engage in that broader discussion, I want to turn to a few thoughts for each of the authors. And forgive me, but what is my time frame again? 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 to 12. So you're 4 minutes in.
Okay. So on the Maya Dalton paper, really impressive research highlighting the value of these newer machine learning techniques, which I'm not very well informed about, over linear regression. There are many interesting findings in this paper. I want to focus on the unexpected findings, and especially where the machine learning and regression models produce different outcomes, and ask you maybe to elaborate on what that means. And the first is the weak predictive power of the judicial corruption and judicial independence variables, which you had sort of posited at the beginning of the paper as being important. And you suggest maybe we need a different measurement of that institutional pathway. But could you say more maybe about why you think the judicial institutions hypothesis had weak support across the models? With respect to the covariates, the machine learning models suggest that population size and economic development matter, but you don't really say much about that at all. I know there were just, I guess GDP was the measure you were using for economic development. I'm also curious to hear about, or more about, why you think some of the efficacy measures, specifically reports of election fraud and the Clean Elections Index, don't matter. And of course, my orientation is the US, where false reports of election fraud generated a completely unprecedented, almost completely unprecedented, unpredictable amount of electoral violence in 2020. So why doesn't that matter? And finally, and this is kind of like a broader question for some of the other papers as well. You note that that violence begets violence, that one of the big, important predictors in these models is the presence or the fact of previous violence. But, what's the temporal scale there? Like how, you talk about in the immediate sense, violence may suppress violence in the next election, but there's sort of an accumulation effect over time that then shows how this lagged violence variable matters. And that just sparked questions generally about the relationship between violence in the general society and electoral violence, and why electoral violence seems to have its own dynamics. And maybe that's not maybe there's an easy answer to that, but it just has me thinking a lot about the role of the way violence is embedded in societies and then carried forward, either through the way in which, if it works, you do it again, I guess, kind of institutionalization process. So moving on to the paper by Pulido Gomez and Torres Salmerón, forgive me for mispronouncing your name. Again, really interesting effort to grapple with the difficulties of observing candidate motivations, which we can't usually observe too well, and the possible effects of organized crime on the shape of electoral choice in Mexico, and perhaps by extension to other Latin American countries at this moment in time. You find that candidate withdrawal is highly context dependent. And following on some of the questions in the chat, just how easy or hard would it be to ask candidates when they withdraw to give a reason, volunteer a reason? Because that seems like that would be fascinating data to kind of bring into your analysis. Let's see. Can you say more about why you think social media presence might be serving as a protective shield against pressure to withdraw from the ballot in the face of, media itself having the opposite effect, as I understand what is it about the social media piece that makes that different from the other forms of social visibility? The paper by Trudeau and Basak on evidence of vote buying in Brazil. I have no quarrels with the use of the OLS estimation models when you have such a large data set, but I am kind of curious why you chose to model the relationships with OLS over some other form of regression analysis. And I have to say, the finding of an almost 16 percentage point advantage to the activities labeled as vote buying just blows my mind. I don't know if that just seems like just way bigger than I would ever expect. And I was a little skeptical of the reliability of the complaint data serving as a proxy for actual attempts or incidents of vote buying, simply because of the limits of my knowledge, again, to the United States, where I've actually analyzed big complaint data sets in the US, and I would never use it as a proxy for actual anything, anything claimed in these complaint files. But again, you kind of persuaded me that you make a good case for using that data. But I still wonder, I still can't quite wrap my head around a 16-point advantage for offering people gifts like that somehow, or patronage or jobs, that really would produce such a winning advantage. That's amazing. So I don't know. What do you think of the question actually I wanted to ask was about the interaction effect that you talk about, where vote buying is statistically significant and coercion and some other forms of malfeasance are statistically significant. So when you put them together, is an interaction effect and look at how they might be operating jointly, it's not statistically significant. So I don't know if you could say more about why that would be. And then quickly, hopefully, onto the paper, Jarabinsky and Mikoczi paper on recounts. Again, another important piece of research. It adds to our knowledge of electoral integrity by analyzing these institutional settings in which vote recounts are conducted. In this instance, across a set of European democracies using this kind of structured, focused, comparative methodology. All of these papers were, very carefully executed. And again, it's just so impressive. So I really like the finality accuracy dilemma concept as a way of organizing how we might think about the paper's central question, because it appears to actually capture the way recounts unfold. And so, and perhaps beyond Europe. I mean, your comparison to the US is fine. Dumping the US out, that makes total sense. but it actually could be useful in the US context as well. And so, again, like other scholars on this panel, you appreciate and grapple with complexity. You identify these 5 dimensions, institutional pathways, and I think it works is what I'm trying to say. But I would say that, and this is kind of leads to the last comments, the last paper I'll comment on, connection. You emphasize that this finality accuracy dilemma doesn't depend on any single design choice, but rather on interactions across these dimensions. So again, like the complexity, the attempt to grapple with complexity is really appreciated there. And so what would be your ideal institutional configuration for governing recounts? There's the problem with parliamentary self-review, but it would be hard. It may not even be totally beneficial to get rid of that. So, where would you, what are the ideal configuration? And that leads me to the comments on the last paper, thoughts there, which is, again, so many ideas and so many recommendations. I appreciate the attempt to sort of classify them into the issues around first establishing legitimacy and then producing credible elections. And so forth. But it was almost, for me, it was a little too hard to understand what to do with all that information. And that's because maybe, I'm not in the NGO world trying to help people sort out these difficult questions. So I would suggest, or, I think it would be great to continue the development of this analysis, maybe to bringing in some more, scientific kind of design to actually showing how these recommendations you're making for what to do, why they matter. The cases are there and the experience is there, and that's very useful. But I was thinking, who is this advice really for? Is it for these transitional governments that I understand you would be working with? Is it for civil society groups to put pressure on these governments to do things in a certain way? Or is it reform politicians to understand better what would work better? So I guess that's the last question, was sort of, what is the capacity for actually implementing these recommendations, and how might you increase that, or we increase that capacity? So thank you again for inviting me to comment on these papers. I really learned a tremendous amount, and again, remain extremely impressed by the talent and thinking that went behind them.
Hey, thank you very much. We have about 13 minutes left for Q&A. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand.